Jack Stanley, and this is part 9 in the history of the American presidency, which I'm just babbling on some information, interesting things, sometimes stuff you don't usually talk about or hear about pertaining to the presidency. And I want to get back to that crazy period of the late 1850s and 1860s. There's so much. And as I have talked to you before about James Buchanan, and James Buchanan was, was a brilliant guy. I mean, he was not dumb at all, but he had issues, and he really was not a very combative individual. And he wasn't a very forceful individual, although he did make his opinions known to certain people. But nonetheless, that the whole country was starting to fall apart just at the point when he's president. And there was probably no one more ill-equipped to handle the situation than James Buchanan. Now, I wanted to try to talk about some of the stuff that was happening in between the administrations of Buchanan and Lincoln, because so much happened. Now, of course, in a sense, the first shots of the Civil War had already taken place. Got to remember the Star of the West was fired upon by the batteries of South Carolina as it tried to provision Fort Sumter. And they announced that they were, a separate country. In fact, in between the administrations of Buchanan and Lincoln, after the election of Lincoln, the South left the Union, formed its own country, and named as its president Jefferson Davis, who had been involved before with Buchanan and with Pierce. In fact, he had been Zachary Taylor's son-in-law. Now, he was a brilliant man, an ardent slaveholder. He had severe views, which many in the South did have. Now, when the South leaves the Union, creates its own government, which they look at it this way, that they are doing exactly what the colonies did in 1776. The American Revolution really isn't too much of a revolution. It was more of a secession from the British government, and they formed their own government. The South looked upon what they were doing as very much like the Patriots of 1776. And you could believe that many of those patriots from 1776 would agree with what the South was doing. You have to understand something. There's much more that's going on behind the lines than what we usually get treated to, especially like kids when they're in school and they read a history book. I mean, sometimes various important facts are relegated to a paragraph. And here is one of the major issues that led to the breakup. And it goes all the way back to the Whigs and Henry Clay. There was something called the American system. That was something that Henry Clay was extremely enamored with, which was building a lot of highways and canals and schools. And also, something else very important was tariffs and taxes. Now, Abraham Lincoln was an old Henry Clay Whig, and he agreed very much with what Henry Clay was proposing. And of course, after Henry Clay died in 1852, Lincoln was one of the greatest proponents of that whole American system. Lincoln was pushing with the Republicans for a vast increase in tariffs and taxes. Now, who was that going to affect the most? The North was a manufacturing sector. You have something called the fall line. And you know, the fall line is very rarely ever talked about. And what is the fall line? It is basically where the water drops off, on the coast from the mountains. And if you notice that up in the northeast, there's a gradual decline as you head toward the ocean. So what this meant with the fall line, that the natural flow of water worked its way toward the coast. That is why you had all the water wheels and all the various water-powered devices on the fall line, going from Massachusetts, working its way down to parts of New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and then it works its way in. There is a fall line in the south, but it's about 300 miles from the Atlantic, which makes it very unusable in many respects. But the thing is that due to the fall line, all the manufacturing sections were powered by water, which was the major source of power until the steam revolution. But nonetheless, they just went from water-powered to steam-powered, and they kept everything where it was, because where the fall line was in the Northeast was extremely close to the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, they could manufacture and ship with very little expense. It was extremely convenient and extremely profitable. Now, what the South was doing was basically agricultural. It was all farming and the like. And of course, a vast majority of slaves were involved in cotton. They were involved in tobacco. All of this was collected. It was processed to a degree and then shipped out. Now, if our tariffs and taxes are going up, the cost to the South is going to go up drastically, because you have to understand something. Those in England and other countries are going to have to pay higher prices due to higher tariffs, and therefore it's going to end up costing a lot more money for the South. Now, they weren't talking about like 5%. They were talking massive amounts, over 30% increases in tariffs. This is part of the Republican platform. And, of course, the South was absolutely shocked by this, because it was going to affect their entire economy. So while so many think the Civil War or the South leaving the Union is just because of slavery, it is not. It's because of money. Almost always when there is a war, or if there is a conflict or a battle of ideology, more often than that you have to follow the line that leads to the money, and you'll usually find the answer. Lincoln wanted to raise tariffs and taxes. Plain and simple. Now you have to remember, the North had only 3 seaports. That's it. The South had all the seaports, because they were dealing with other countries, producing their raw products. Also, another area that they were dealing with a lot was New York City. Much of the cotton would be brought up to New York City, to all the mills in New York and New Jersey, because that's where the fall line was once again. And those products would be made there and then sold. And so it's an interesting thing that the fall line's important, manufacturing's important, but most importantly, money. Now, of course, the South had slavery. It had been an integral part of the life of the South for, well, well over, by that point, well over 100+ years. And they weren't going to give it up. They believed it was a God-given right, because the Bible had said constantly about slavery, and they used the words of the holy book, as it were, to show that slavery was neither immoral or basically illegal. Of course, the North felt differently. Abraham Lincoln, by this point, felt differently. He was really getting to be quite the politician, and quite the politician dealing with slavery. It had been his bully pulpit for the last 7 or 8 years, talking about slavery, when he found something new he could talk about. Now, Lincoln became an ardent and very powerful voice against slavery. Now, while he said that he wasn't against slavery, he was very much in favor of making sure it did not expand into the territories. And a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Lincoln, and also coming out of the Republican Party and other members of the Republican Party, got to remember the Republican Party had attracted a whole mess of individuals. Being a new party, the Whigs had died. You had the Know-Nothings, you had old Federalists, you had this, that, and everything else all joining it. And some of the voices coming out of the Republican Party were damn scary. And so the South was not going to be happy with a Republican candidate. Lincoln was elected. The South had a fit. And the South decided it was time to go, because it was no longer an environment in which they could live comfortably, peacefully, and financially within the union that existed at that time. And that was the issue as Lincoln works his way toward becoming president. Now, Lincoln doesn't say a word. He's very, very, very quiet. However, there are many others within the Republican Party, there are many others within the Democratic Party who are not following that policy, who are saying many, many things that are very frightening to both sides. Now, of course, slavery rears its ugly head. You have the abolitionist movement in the North, which isn't that big, to be honest. But they were very vocal. And they looked upon this as the chance to remove slavery. Now, the other thing that's a little hypocritical about a lot of the people involved in the anti-slavery movement, and that was they didn't want the slaves up by them either. They didn't want the free blacks moving to the North. So as much as they were fighting and saying that it was bad and it was awful, they didn't want them up by them. You had the Underground Railway. They were taking them up to Canada in many cases. Of course, there were some that were going to areas like Philadelphia or New York or Massachusetts. Frederick Douglass, who becomes a major factor, is basically a slave who has bought his freedom, more or less. And, of course, there are a lot of people wanting to get Frederick Douglass. He was a slave. He was helped by people, and he became a strong advocate for removing slavery. But he realized that the politicians, being politicians, weren't too enthralled with trying to get rid of slavery. They had to look at the political ramifications. And that drove Douglas crazy because he realized that they were going to talk and talk and talk, but they might not do anything. So, Lincoln is ready to become president, and I will continue that as we reach number 10 on this series.